Thundridge Manor, which used to be over here behind these trees, is mentioned in the Domesday Book, but there's been a church on this site since long before then. This tower was built in the 15th century, and since then it's undergone many changes, the extent of which we'll never understand. But one thing we do know for certain is that this church hasn't always looked like this. It used to be covered in a smooth white render, in common with most medieval buildings of the time. It used to look more like this. I think it's fair to say that most of us believe that medieval churches should look like this, where the flint and the rubble is exposed. But here in St Andrew's Church in West Dereham, Norfolk, half of this church has been rendered in this smooth white finish, which some people say is the original look. I'm going to meet an architect who knows all about this. In fact, he's behind the transformation of this St Andrew's Church.
So what you can see here is the nave and the tower of St Andrew's West Ratton, which is a typical appearance of many of our churches in East Anglia. And we all think that they should look like this. This is a rubble wall construction, a solid wall about 80 centimetres thick or so, built of fieldstones and flints taken from the fields and any other stone that was lying around. But that appearance is wholly compromised. It's not doing the church in any way any favours. It's not doing the fabric any good, and it's not doing those who use the church any favours whatsoever. What the church should look like is what we have here in the chancel, where we were lucky enough to re-render it. There was evidence of renders here originally, and when I said to the lay rector, quite honestly, we should replaster it, they said, okay, actually let's do that. And I admit it's a very different aesthetic, but I think it's not an unattractive one. There is no decent building stone in East Anglia. The only sort of local stone to here in the Middle Ages was clunch, which was a very soft stone, and it needed to be protected, and the medieval masons understood this, and they would have lime washed that stone. But as you can see, you can see all that exposed rubble walling, and quite honestly, it would not have been left exposed like that in the Middle Ages. It would have been rendered with a thin coat of plaster, and most probably lined out to look like stone, because they wanted it to look like stone to make it look like that high status building which they could not otherwise achieve. And that would have basically given a uniform appearance that they wanted to achieve. They had a completely different approach to aesthetics. We might think that looks all very sort of charming, but they weren't after all that character that we so love nowadays.
So was their approach to it more practical than aesthetic, do you think?
Well, it was both really. It was both very pragmatic. They knew that the surface needed to be protected and finished, because it would have been very rough and irregular, and they would have wanted to straighten it out as much as possible and make it look as smart and as posh as possible. So it had two effects. It protected the fabric, but it also gave them the aesthetic that they wanted. They would have then gone on to lime wash it and lime wash that in with the window masonry and the door masonry, and they might have introduced some colours. It's difficult to find that evidence now, admittedly, but looking back at medieval manuscripts, I think we can sort of get an idea sometimes of what they did.
What kind of physical evidence can we see today on a church to indicate that it was once rendered?
Well, there's a lot really if you look closely. I mean, often I see remnants of render and mortars on the stone dressings of door jambs and window jambs, and on the rubble itself. and on individual stones.
How much responsibility did the Victorian restorers bear?
The Victorians did a lot of good in many respects, but they got this one sort of aspect sort of critically wrong, and that was as a result of one or two people sort of moralising about materials and suggesting that it was like fake news, really, to have plaster imitating stone, which is, you know, what they did on the outside and on the inside. And there's obviously a lot more evidence on the inside. I'm sure many people have seen medieval plasters on the inside of churches painted with lines, you know, to look like ashlar masonry. And unfortunately, you know, people took against that as being fake and consequently scraped it off. Well, you could say that render went out of fashion in the late 19th century. There was a lot of restoration that Victorians undertook, and unfortunately they felt that external render and sometimes internal plasters as well just were not appropriate, inauthentic. They felt it was insincere that they should imitate stone. Them removing and scraping away the external renders to expose the rubble stonework, and also the stone internally, where there was sort of ashlar stone inside. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to have rubble stonework inside. That would have looked horrendous, although I'm sure there are some examples of that. But
So was this a Victorian thing?
yes, very much so, unfortunately. And it's very unfortunate because they have crippled the fabric as a result. The fabric can't dry out in the same way that it was able to before, and it has unfortunately sort of imperiled the fabric and the internal environment as a result.
So what we often think of as the authentic look of these churches may actually be the result of later changes. And in many cases, returning the render isn't altering history, it's restoring it. Would you like your local church to be rendered white? Leave a comment below.